Okay, can everyone see the screen? Good. Thanks, Seth. Oh, how about now? Yes, still. Good, okay, because it just went to my other screen. So art and time and space, varying the modes of perception. So I guess I'm considering this part 2 of last week's work. So this image here, it was circulating in the art press over the past week. And one thing that's interesting to me about it is, I mean, it seems like this awesome slice into time from the perspective of the present. But after reading about it, I found out that actually the Buddha with the head cut off is not so old. It's after 1900. So it's not, we're not going back hundreds of years here. It's more like it was already part of modernity when, you know, the head was cut off and the construction was built. Just a quick review from what we talked about last week, so I think I can build on that. So we have geometrical optics. I'm not going to talk about it other than to name it. And we'll think of it as a theoretical space of measurement. And then we have physiological optics, which is the optics of perception and the idiosyncrasies of vision. Now, tonight I'm talking about time and space, which I'll link to ideas from science, but also more specifically to media. So by space, I mean outer space, but I also mean stereoscopic depth media, and time being time-based media. But so the Nathan Lyons image is probably, you know, it's a great image to explain physiological optics. And also for Seth's kids, and in the spirit of last week, and also because I'm going to talk a little bit about Einstein tonight, here's a illusion of high and low frequency, which is a perfect example, again, of physiological optics. So the way to look at this is that high frequency information is sharp, very sharp stuff, and low frequency is blurry stuff. And so, so you have Einstein in this high frequency sharp drawing, and below Einstein is the face of another icon, Marilyn Monroe, who is shown in low frequency. So if you kind of blur your eyes when you're looking at this, maybe get a little bit away from your screen, you'll see Marilyn Monroe in there. I think everyone can do that, hopefully. Seth, can your kids see that? Blur their eyes. So tell them to blur their eyes.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Totally.
Perfect. Okay. Good, guys. All right. So you've all seen the Bernie memes this week, which I'm thinking of as sort of a benign internet virus, as opposed to the viruses of that are not so benign that, you know, contributed to the insurrection. But we talked about the Seurat painting last week, and then I happened to see this one from Jerry Saltz. So it sort of ties in on several levels. To see Bernie in there, you know, it doesn't make any sense, and yet we all are enjoying it. So, all right, here's the serious part. So I talked about this last week a little bit. So at the top, we have this thing I'm calling the frustrum, which is the bisecting of the cone and leaving this user interface, which is also the viewfinder of the apparatus meaning the camera. The next one is a sort of visual describing a panorama. So the panoramic vision is the vision that's all around us. Somebody said, it was Oliver Sacks actually, I think, who said that predators in, sort of the bio model of the world, predators tend to have stereoscopic vision, and prey tend to have panoramic vision. Where the eyes are sort of on the sides of the head, and they can see in all directions at once. It's a two-dimensional vision, but if it's very strong with motion detection. So if something moves, the prey has an opportunity to run away from the predator, who needs the stereoscopic vision to focus in and strike to capture the prey. So Pan was a Greek god, but pandemic is what we're going through right now. And it's affecting everything. And the Pantheon is one of the great buildings. It's in Rome. It's one of the few Roman buildings that is still intact. And it supposedly, what it was is actually really interesting. The Roman Empire conquered many countries, many lands, and supposedly the Pantheon was the temple to celebrate all of the conquered gods of all of these conquered nations. So yes, Pan means everything. The field, which is a kind of a wonderful term, I was just reading an essay by Meyer Shapiro about it. It's the cropped space that we see when we look at the frustrum. And it's both the 2D surface and the 3D illusionistic space, and it is monocular as opposed to binocular. The frame, okay, so there's the field at the bottom, there's the frame. So the frame is around the field. And according to Meyer Shapiro, the frame is in our world, the world of the spectator, whereas the image is in the other world. Those of us who are photographers, we, have some choices to make in terms of how to the condition of spectatorship in which we wish to share our work. And so in a gallery situation, one can, crop the image right to the edge, or we can frame it. And so perhaps those comments will be suggestive. Below is a graphic representation of what I'm thinking of as a binocular or stereoscopic image. And it's also been called the transplane image. And I like the term, but I had some difficulty with the, Jen Schroeder is the writer, art historian who talks about the transplane image. Because the problem I have is he included sculpture. And I don't know, it was hard for me to deal with, the kinds of media that we work with and sculpture as under the same category. So this, during the COVID lockdown, I was in Long Island helping to take care of an elderly relative. And I discovered that there was a tremendous amount of places to go hiking in the area related to these old mansions that used to be there. And, because of for tax reasons, those places got turned into public areas. But I started walking around in there and photographing, and I sort of got interested in questioning the frame, what the frame is. And so, there is this idea that at the frame, there is this continuation of the pattern that you see within the frame. It's like this illusion of this continuation, which you don't see. And so I started sort of playing with that as kind of a puzzle, and I decided to show this one tonight. And I think of this as three-dimensional. It was all sort of taken in the same area, but the dimensions are not X, Y, and Z. So they're not the Cartesian coordinates. So it's another kind of three-dimensional image. Whoops. These are all the words that we think of when we talk about looking at art or just looking. They have, different kinds of weights, different cultural expectations are tied to them. But I thought it would be useful to make a list, and it has something to do with what we're going to be talking about next. This is the Minkowski diagram of the space-time volume. And I know that sounds very scientific, but I think you'll find it interesting if you bear with me for a moment. So in the center, okay, you can see my moving cursor, I think. So right in the middle here of this double light cone, this is where we are, the spectator, the observer. And so the world can't exist outside of the light cone. And the lower cone is the past, and the top is the future. And this is the present. But then these things get folded on top of each other, as you'll see in a moment. So time is the vertical axis here. But as you approach light speed, then strange things happen because past and present merge and things stretch. And this is supposedly, this is the scientific explanation for physical reality, the physical reality that we're photographing. Supposedly does this according to special theory of relativity. And black holes are punctures in this space-time. So I think it's interesting to think about that schema against the standard one of geometrical optics, which is the visual pyramids shown here on the left. One thing that is interesting is the geometrical rectangular schema is a abstraction of actually the cone of vision, which is not rectangular, it's circular. So as you approach the speed of light, time gets distorted and forms get distorted. So this is the famous Dali painting. And this was a work by Michael Friesen. It's a GAN render. It's just a short GIF made from it. So that's the updated version of the Dali painting. Here's another schema of time, map of time, from Emma Willard. It's very chronological, and it's very educational. But education back then was, grounded in the classics and also in Christianity. So instead of the Big Bang, there's creation that we see way back there. Only 4,000 years ago, it turns out. They made a TV show based on a comic book called The Watchmen. And there's a character who's blue in the comic book. And that character can see past, present, and future at the same time. Now, what's interesting is that what that really means in terms of, science fiction, which is based on, science to some extent, is that means Dr. Manhattan is always moving at the speed of light. So this is one of Einstein's famous Gedanken experiments. And so basically, if you just look at the picture, you'll get the idea. There's two brothers, and one of them goes into outer space. He's an astronaut, while the other one stays on the Earth. And then at some point, that guy, the astronaut, returns, and the astronaut has gotten, according to this graphic, slightly older, whereas the brother who stayed on the Earth has gotten significantly older. And so that's known as time dilation, and also the twin paradox. So it also brings to mind the fact that in science, physics, the point of view of the observer is sublimely important. Everything has to be predicated on, the point of observation. And I think there's this analogy to, us as the observer, the artist as the observer. It's important where we observe from. So here's a science example of a black hole. And as you'll see, it's just a couple of seconds here. Those are rays of light that are assembling around the black hole. The gravity, the tremendous gravity of the black hole is warping the light. But from another angle, it looks like the image that we just saw. So everything depends on where you observe from, because that's what it really looks like. But then from the perspective of another observer, it looks like a circle. Here's some quotes that I think I reproduced in the announcement for the workshop, but I thought they were useful here. So Wagner was a 19th century composer of operas. And in Parzival, one of his characters says, "In this realm, time becomes space," which, he predates Einstein, but now we know that's true. Edgar Allan Poe also, way before Einstein, he says, space and duration are one. And then Einstein says the most interesting thing. Space and time are modes in which we think, not conditions in which we exist. Because space and time are really the same thing. And yet we think in terms of space and time. This lecture is an hour and 15 minutes long, and we can have dinner afterwards. It's a chronological kind of thing. This also, I put this in here. This has been circulating in the art press the past month or so, and what you see is multiple paths of the sun, and the artist Regina Valkenburg made a pinhole camera out of a beer can, and but the reason that this got so much attention, because there are a lot of pinhole photographs that resemble this, but this is possibly the longest duration one. So they're always talking about, they find some new cave painting and, oh, this is the oldest one. I don't know how they figure that stuff out, but we keep finding older and older examples of that. So maybe we'll keep finding older examples of photographs with long duration. So now I'll spend a little bit of time thinking about early photography, and you'll see why. This one I love. I don't know if you know these about this, the night albums. Does anyone know about the night albums? Okay, so Thomas Wedgwood, who was the son of the famous potter Josiah Wedgwood, and Humphrey Davy, who was his friend and the most important experimental scientist of the age. And they were also friends with Coleridge, and they traveled abroad together and did these things. Anyway, so Wedgwood was an early experimenter in photography. And so we know that, Daguerre and William Henry Fox Talbot are really credited as the first, genuine photographers. But this Wedgwood thing really strikes me because, they would get together and they made these sort of photograms, which they call profiles or shadows. And, they would put down lace or a leaf onto paper, then expose it. And they didn't fix the image, right? And so that's the thing that distinguishes from what the Wedgwoods did from what Wedgwood did from what Daguerre and Talbot were able to do. Although there's some question because, he doesn't get any credit, but John Herschel is the one who discovers how to fix images, really. And he, both Daguerre and Talbot don't really come up with photography until he teaches them how to do that. And so, and he didn't want to take any credit for it because, he was already, Herschel, probably the most prestigious scientist of his time. Anyway, so what I love here is the duration of these images, images that were stored in these so-called night albums, which basically were like a book made out of black pages. So you would slip the developed but not fixed image into the book with the black pages called a night album, and then you could take the image out and look at it by candlelight. Right, and you definitely couldn't expose it to the sun or it would disappear really quickly. But if you only looked at it for some seconds under, a lamplight, you could maybe, or moonlight, you could maybe hold on to these for quite a while. And so I discovered this comment by this guy, Samuel Hiley, who was an editor for the Photographic News, which still exists. And in an 1885 issue, Hiley mentions offhandedly that only last night, this is 1885, and Thomas Wedgwood is doing the experiments in 1792. It's almost 100 years later. So Hiley's saying, oh yeah, last night I was looking at some of Wedgwood's specimens. 100 years later, right? So none of these, there was some excitement a couple of years ago. Someone was arguing that maybe they found one, but then it just, evaporated. I didn't hear anything more about it. But according to this guy, Hiley, who was, a very respectable guy who, wrote about photography, and he says that, the duration of one of these, at least one of these Wedgwood experiments is almost 100 years. Okay. This is not the usual Daguerre image that they show when they're trying to talk about Daguerre. You always show the image of the guy getting a shoe shine, right? For obvious reasons, maybe it's a better image. But metaphorically, and so much about, photography and the stereoscope, according to the Frankfurt philosophers and so on, is as a mode of thinking as much as it is as a mode of capturing images. But so here, Daguerre, who, by the way, was a very talented painter. I mean, he was a famous French designer for the stage and did these incredible trompe-l'oeil paintings as part of set design. He also painted panoramas before that, working for other people. But so he was a very talented artist, and Daguerre. And so here is this image of shells and fossils, 1839, and there is some similarity between a fossil, which captures a trace, and a photograph. And so I have to believe that Daguerre is here thinking that photographs are like fossils of light. And here's my Talbot image. And I decided not to show a Fox Talbot image. I'm showing a Connie Talbot image. Now, Connie Talbot is this extraordinary person who you may know, from reading the history of photography, because what happens is on their wedding trip after they get married, they go to Italy, and they're hanging out at Lake Como, and they're using a camera lucida, which is sort of a prism on a stick. And so you can, using the prism, you can kind of see the paper in front of you and also the landscape at the same time. So you can sort of trace the outlines. You still have to be able to draw well to get a good image. Well, Connie was an artist, and she was very good at it. And Fox, or Henry, was just pitiful. And so, the story he tells, right? The story he tells in the book he published, the first book of photography, Pencil of Light, Pencil of Nature. He says that he became so disgusted with his ability to draw using the camera lucida that he had to invent photography. Well, those in the Royal Society had already seen some kinds of photographs. Niepce had traveled to England, and members of the Royal Society had these things. They were photograms, not camera obscura captures. But this image here, which Connie makes, the last rose of summer left blooming alone, all her lovely companions are faded and gone. So it's obviously, it's a metaphor of photography again, right? And she's the first woman photographer. And she she's the wife of, the famous inventor and scientist who, he invents other things too. He did a lot of work in mathematics. There's something called Talbot's curve, which is still referred to today. And he also worked with persistence of vision, apparent motion, before he invents photography. That was the project he was doing just before. And then Charles Wheatstone asks him to make stereo photographs. And so as it happens, Talbot creates a still, moving, and depth work right from the beginning. Okay, because we always talk about this chronology of, still and depth and then moving, but actually Talbot's doing it all right at the beginning, which is interesting. Talbot also had a very dynamic mother. And if you read about Talbot, she will be very present. She's a great writer. Women were not allowed to go to Oxford or Cambridge, but wealthy women managed to get themselves pretty well educated anyway. And so, as it says here, she pressured Talbot about his art and suggested ideas for his photographs, critiqued them, supervised the photographic sessions, and promoted her son's work. But she didn't take photographs. But Connie takes photographs. And so, like, the two of them, this is who Talbot is. Talbot isn't just Talbot. Talbot is Connie and also Lady Fielding. That's what those photographs represent. So now I'm going to jump to Antoine Claudet, who figures in, is a very important figure in stereophotography in particular, but he's also the first person to create, for instance, a panoramic photograph. He's the first person to create the darkroom light. So essentially he invents the darkroom. He also speeds up both Daguerre's process and Talbot's process and makes portrait photography possible. And so he's the first portrait photographer. And I know this to be true because in his nomination certificate to the Royal Society, written by Michael Faraday, the greatest experimental scientist of his time, who nominates him, it says that. It says he invented portrait photography. And that's why. This is another work he did. He did this multiple exposure work of the moon. Maybe it's the first multiple exposure photograph. I don't know. Maybe it's the first lunar one. So Talbot and Claudet, who are very close friends, and they play chess together, and there are photographs of them playing chess together. They both work on still, moving, and depth together. And so in this book I'm writing, I'm going to argue that it's a useful thought experiment. Now, we all know what a thought experiment is, a Gedanken, because we just looked at Einstein's. This is a useful way to think about photography, as thinking that these mediums, all three of these mediums, land all at the same time. And the image that you're looking at is a photo montage by Max Ernst, part of the one of his collage novels, Little Girl Dreams of Taking the Veil. But part of the source material comes from a scientific journal describing the work of Etienne Jules Marais, who much later, along with Muybridge, they're credited as the people who sort of move photography into cinema. And they do amazing work, and their work is compelling. But Claudet and Talbot are exploring these things like 30 years earlier, and they're not generally talked about, especially in the history of cinema. So the Delirium of Modernity is sort of my subtitle for this thing. This surrealistic vision of this woman inside this zoetrope, experiencing this flickering light, this sort of animation of the dynamic modernity. So the Flatlanders are a country, they used to be, I don't know if they still are around, but a very good country band. And one of their lyrics is, everybody's saying it's just about time, but it's partly about space. So now I'm going to talk about depth media. That's an old stereoscope that has been scanned on a flatbed scanner. So it's like looking at it with a different optic. Moving briefly into the distant future, as you know, VR is a stereoscopic medium. And we here at my house, we bought an Oculus Quest 2 over the holidays, which is $300. It's kind of inexpensive, actually. And it opens up, like all the other devices were like crazy expensive, or they gave you headaches, like terrible headaches. But this one is really, really interesting. And for $300, it allows you entrance into this world. And a tip is that I would buy, if you have one, you should buy Tilt Brush. Tilt Brush is a kind of a simple paint system. I don't know, something simpler than Photoshop, but it allows you to paint in 3 dimensions. And it's quite an extraordinary experience if you haven't had that. And I actually did have the experience, I knew about it, but spending time with it has been useful research for me. Okay, so embodiment. I'm just saying one thing about VR tonight, but embodiment is one of the strangest things that's possible in VR, is that somehow you, the way we plug our nervous systems into Zoom and we try to communicate through this frame, this frustrating frustrum, and push our nervous system through this thing to communicate, to touch, the rest of us, is fascinating, but fascinating that we've been able to do it, and that we've somehow entered into this acceptance of this ability to move our nervous systems in this way. We've built new neural pathways to do this. But Thomas Metzinger is a philosopher, and he talks about this stuff. So he says, imagine you are lying, the image is from something else, which I'll talk about in a second. Metzinger says, imagine you're lying on your back using a brain scanner that allows you to operate a robot by remote control. You see through its eyes and even feel motor feedback from its arms and legs. Experientially, you completely identify with the robot. So we've talked about cyborgs, and we've talked about how we are cyborgs because we always have an iPhone in our hand. We are part of this. This machine is part of us. So with a VR system, you can become this other kind of being. And the other image that I put down there is from, it's an artwork called Gender Swap by sort of an architectural arts group called Be Another Lab. And what they're doing is they're swapping genders. And so the male is getting feedback about as if his body were female, and then the female is getting the reverse kind of feedback. You know, it opens up some thinking, which is why I'm showing it. So now I'm going to sort of return to the past. Past and the future are the same, so it's okay. So this is actually part of a stereoscopic, one side of a stereoscopic photo, and I just wanted to have it really big on screen so you could see it. It's not just an ordinary family, because the photograph by Antoine Claudet is a photograph of the Charles Wheatstone family. So Charles Wheatstone is one of the preeminent scientists of his time, and he's fooling around with this object, and the object, you know, has these little wave forms on it, and this is an object that he invented to basically explain the wave theory of light. So as we know, you know, sometimes light is a particle and sometimes it's a wave. And just by observing it, we can change that, as has been proven by experiment. This is the very machine that he invented, and the music isn't his, although he was also a composer. But you can see these waveforms being manipulated with this analog process. So that's that. So I'm going to say that a stereograph, a stereo image made up of two pictures or two sequences of pictures, are a hybrid of still and moving. And the reason, I guess here I'm talking about, is still a 19th century stereograph. The two images that are in a stereograph are the first two images of a moving picture. And I'm going to, it's not just, you know, random thinking. There are primary texts from that time that will legitimize that. So maybe it's not true for all stereographs, or maybe it could be, but there are some stereographs from the 19th century that are specifically designed as experiments with motion. So I'm going to call those chronostereographs, stereographs contaminated by time duration. So this one, I know I showed a few of these a couple of months ago when I was on a panel with Lyle, but I didn't really have time to explicate them. We all had just a couple of minutes. But this one is time as a metaphor. So you see the ghostly hands showing the with wing figure of time. Back to Claudet. This is a picture, a self-portrait of Claudet, and notice that the hand position has changed. So there's duration when you go from one image to the other. And what are those hands doing? Well, they're showing the extent of the motion of the movement of smoking a cigarette or smoking something. So it's a kind of a two-frame micro cinema. It's a, and actually, let me show it first. So that's possibly certainly maybe the first photographic moving image. possibly. So, yeah, these two frames, which Claudet has some interesting comments about, which we'll get to in a slide or two, constitute a kind of cinema, of micro cinema, like somehow the quantum element in cinema. And finding it here is really interesting to me because, Eisenstein was very involved with stereo perception. I'm not going to talk about him tonight, but I'll just mention Vertov, because he has his theory of the interval, which is essentially based on this idea of this two-frame cinema. Okay, so here's what Claudet says. I have found that only two pictures are sufficient to elicit the phenomenon of motion. Although the illusion of reality suffers from the abruptness of the two extreme movements and from the deficiency of intermediate positions, the instrument in its simple state with only two pictures will suffice to illustrate the principle and at the same time to elicit some curious phenomenon of the perception of vision. So, Gestalt Psychology, that starts 1912, and Max Wertheimer, he publishes his study on phi phenomenon, which is essentially, this is all the same thing. This is the illusion that is behind cinema. Oops. And so this is the scientific basis of cinema. And it's sort of the founding experiment of the Gestalt school. So both Gestalt and sort of the scientific analysis of cinema come from this phi phenomenon. Okay. Moving backwards in time for a moment. In order for Claudet to have made that example of quantum cinema, what I'm calling quantum cinema, first they had to freeze the photograph image, right? It had to be possible to make a freeze frame. This, which in the world of stereo photographic collecting, they call a genre photograph because it's about, people going to a horse race. Well, this image is not a true frozen moment. This is a simulated one, right? Because it's trying to show, this frozen frame of this, frenetic activity of this horse race. Again, years before Muybridge does the same thing for real, but they simulate it. And so those horses are made out of paper mache, right? But still the scene has this kind of frenetic quality, but it's the simulation of the instant. Here's another form of motion, deliberate motion in early stereographs. It's a still life, but if you look at it, you'll see, for instance, here, there's a red shell here and a blue shell here, right? These are images that have been hand tinted, hand colored. Also, this shell here is reddish and this is blue. This here is red, this is yellow, this is red, this is blue. All of those things are intentional. And the reason is when you do a stereoscopic fusion of these two images, the color kind of pulses and creates a kind of a shimmer, which is known as luster. But it's a deliberate 19th century form of animation. This one, I sort of learned everything I know from this one photograph. It's an exaggeration, but it's a photograph of a temple on the Roman Forum in Rome by Joseph Spitthover. And what you see is that on the left, there's a large group of trees down at the street level. And on the right, they're either cut down or they are growing. Either way, there could be like a tremendous amount of time, duration encoded in these two pictures. Could be as much as a couple of years, few years. And it's almost like a Borgesian trope, like the Aleph, right? That, that Spitthover, gets us to fuse this incredible duration. It's like it's madness. It's fantastic. Giorgio Sommer. He's another photographer working with all kinds of forms of photography, but one of which is stereo photography, and specifically stereoscopic motion. So here's a still life. Now, notice this figure is in these two different positions. And let's think of it as like a walking figure. Now I'm going to play this. So there's this incredible crowd movement in the streets, traces of motion. It's this two-frame cinema, which you can see sort of by blinking your eyes. There were, kind of stereo systems for stereoscopes, but they didn't catch on. Most people, did it this way, just by, opening and closing your eyes, blinking, right? And the effect is that it creates this kind of photographic motion, again, 20 years or more before Muybridge and Marais. And like, if you just found one picture like this, you would say, okay, maybe this is like an accident, right? Because often they would take a picture and then they would move the camera and take another one. There were twin lens cameras that captured together, but before that they would sort of move the camera. But in the case of Sommer, like he does things like this constantly. I found like dozens and dozens of examples where he's doing the same thing. This is maybe my favorite one, but okay. This is later, but it's another illusion of motion. And it's sort of the calling card of a stage magician whose name is Hereward Carrington. And it's like, it's the famous story of the statue that comes to life, right? In this case, he's calling it Pharaoh's daughter to add sort of a, Egyptian design quality to it. But when you look at this through a stereoscope and you sort of work with your vision, you can sort of gradually create this dissolve from the sculpture into the real woman, just like in the famous story of Pygmalion. Pygmalion is the sculptor who falls in love with his statue, and a goddess brings his statue alive. Here is another form of motion in early stereo. Warren de la Rue is actually the first person to take photographs of the moon. And he later, after doing that, he made a lot of stereo pictures. But the moon does not rotate like the Earth rotates. The moon is always facing us in the way we know it to face us. And the dark side of the moon always faces away from us, right? But over the course of a few months, there's something called libration, and the moon kind of wiggles. And if you catch the moon at the limits of its libration, then you can convert that movement into a stereoscopic image. And that's what this represents. And here is another stereo picture based on motion. It's one of Charles Darwin's experiments. The photograph was taken by his son. But the plant is called the Jade Plant. And the Jade Plant is famous because it has, even more than a sunflower, it has the most dramatic heliocentric permutation. In other words, the way it moves against the sun, when it gets the sunlight, it moves, right? And so these are extremes of the movement of the Jade Plant. And when you look at it through the stereoscope, you don't really see a stereo image at all. But what you see as you blink your eyes is this movement of the sort of between the limits of the movement of this plant. And it's an example of the stereoscope being used as a stereo comparator. And stereo comparators are probably, they've been used quite a bit for, aerial photography, for military use. But most famously, they've been used for examining Shakespeare folios, because to see differences between the different Shakespeare folios in the Folger library, they use a stereo comparator. So that was invented later by Carl Pulfrick, who is a fascinating scientist. But Darwin is already using the stereoscope as a stereo comparator much earlier. So as sort of like a little science experiment, I found these are like Russian stereo images. And I'm just checking my time. So if you sort of let your eyes relax into these, and maybe kind of cross your eyes, you may be able to see some stereoscopic phenomena. And I'm not going to stop sharing my screen right now, but let me just say that these work really great. So if you just take a moment and allow your eyes to sort of reconverge, like maybe you've encountered in like bathrooms or kitchens some geometric tiles, and let your eyes wander, and sometimes seeing illusions of depth illusions from that. So this is kind of a great example of very easily creating a depth experience from these like 1950s Russian things. This is obviously much later. This is from a book by the scientist Steinmetz, who was a close friend of Einstein's. And he was the genius behind the General Electric company. And he was also friends with Tesla. And he was an expert in alternating current. And the General Electric company became the powerhouse that it did. At one point, it was the biggest company in the world. It no longer is. I think maybe Apple is. But he was their chief scientist. And so he wrote a book on Einstein's general theory. And he created these images showing the curvature of space-time that are stereoscopic. And here is another kind of space I'm throwing in here, Lefebvre. He says, what we are concerned with then is the long history of space, even though space is neither a subject or an object, but rather a social reality, that is to say, a set of relations and forms. Lefebvre has been an influence on a lot of artists and architects. And I happen to know Lucy Raven as one example. And this is an interesting permutation on dimension. This film called Curtains is anaglyphic, sometimes unresolvably anaglyphic. But it's a film about the industry of converting traditional Hollywood type films into 3D, which was popular like a decade or so ago. And so there are all these sweatshops, like mostly in Asia, where they were doing this. And so she made this film about that. And so, so here she's exploring space, in terms of perception, but she's also exploring space in terms of the social space that Lefebvre speaks of. Okay, crystals. So crystals were always associated with stereoscopic perception. This is from a early textbook, but showing this like diamond structure, which is a 3D drawing. This is Marcel Duchamp's stereoscopy à la main, which is also known as the handmade stereopticon slide and has some other names too. There were two versions of it, which you see. There's the original on the top, and then there's the one from the box and valise, which was the sort of limited edition salesman's valise of all of Duchamp's most important artworks. He included this work in that. So I think you can see from this that there's, that this is really Duchamp's doing an anamorphic stretching of the sort of very basic, crystal shape, right? There are actually whole books, in the 19th century of about crystals with stereoscopic drawings of all of the different forms. So the other thing, this is one of the prototypes of the large glass. In a sense, the geometrical form is the nude, the four-dimensional nude in the top part of the large glass. The image works stereoscopically to some extent, but it's also a 2D reversible figure. So if you look at the reversible figure in the lower right, that we're all familiar with, the Duchamp's figure flips in 2D and also in 3D. So maybe you can see it flip in 2D if you look at it. Some Duchamp, historians have dismissed this as a minor artwork, but the fact that he included it in the box and valise, and he is obsessed with stereoscopic modes of perception throughout his career, suggests to me that it's dangerous to say any work by Duchamp is just this or that. For me, this is an important work. Going back in time, we're still talking about crystals. There's this work, which is, I wish I could show it to you in a stereoscope. It's a photograph of Yosemite by Carlton Watkins. So Watkins is one of the great artists of the 19th century, a spectacular photographer, formal and modernist and extraordinary in his work. But he also made a relatively large series of mirror views in Yosemite. And these views work equally well upside down and right side up. So like Duchamp, it's a kind of reversible figure. And it's also a kind of a crystal view of, mirror reflections, okay? You can see the falls reflected in the water. It's a spectacular image. This is the cover to J.G. Ballard's The Crystal World. The Max Ernst drew the work, that painting. It's borrowed from Max Ernst, and the image influenced Robert Smithson. The book, The Crystal World, influenced Robert Smithson. And Robert Smithson was essentially an expressionist painter, not even an abstract expressionist. He, was kind of an expressionist painter. And then he embarks on Enantiomorphic Chambers, which is based on Charles Wheatstone's mirror stereoscope, but instead of images, he puts mirrors. And so it creates a kind of mirror at repetition, like the hall at Versailles, two mirrors facing each other. It creates this infinity space. And it's Enantiomorphic Chambers, not Chambers, I misspelled that. I was sort of racing earlier today. It's this work that launches him into the whole idea of non-sights and the use of mirrors, and ultimately I just put this in because it's symmetry. And then this is Spiral Jetty, the film he made of Spiral Jetty. I'm not going to show the whole thing. I just want to say that this is like the best way to see Spiral Jetty, not from the perspective on the ground, but from flying in a helicopter on top of it. That's how it's made to be seen. So Spiral Jetty becomes this, kind of metaphor of true space, outer space, spiral nebula, and the outer limits of art and earthworks. And so, but it's Enantiomorphic Chambers, it's Wheatstone's stereoscope that brings him to that point. So I think I'm getting towards the end because I'm trying to, end at 8:15. I wouldn't be talking about Deleuze unless it made sense. So Cinema 1 and Cinema 2 are kind of amazing books if you have the stomach for it. But very specifically in Cinema 2, he talks about the crystal metaphor. And again, crystals are like so associated with time, with stereo perception, with Robert Smithson. And so Deleuze says, the richest way of looking at the representation of time and images, refracted, frozen, multiplied, fragmented, and always thrown back on the present, is this idea of the crystal. And this, was floating around on the internet. It's this incredible minute of animation, which I'm about to play. It's the Crystallized Ice in Siberia, called Walking on Lake Baikal by Nature is Amazing. I don't know who Nature is Amazing is, but he made this. So watch this. And he does this like, so it's very three-dimensional, but we're getting the dimensions not stereoscopically with depth vision, but with parallax. And so there he flips over and we see this crystalline ice structure. And I think this is my end here from Hito Steyer. All those of you who took classes with me know that I'm a fan of hers. But she says, the present feels as if it is constituted by emptying out the future to sustain a looping version of a past that never existed. And I'm sure she wrote this before the Trump administration, but it just, you know, it says what I was feeling. And, you know, I guess I put this in here. This is a photogrammetry model of a house that I got interested in out on Long Island that was designed by Arakawa and Ginz, artist Arakawa and Ginz. And I made a film about this house. And the idea, Arakawa and Ginz's idea, was that by interacting with this house, you could live forever. You would not die. And, you know, there's, it's the easiest to take it as a metaphor, okay? But both of them died too young. They were friends of mine. But they gave me the keys to Bioscleaf House, and I spent a lot of time there studying it. And I found this outtake today that I didn't use in the film, but I just thought it would be a good way to end this little talk. It's just a minute. So, you know, I should say, here you're sort of outside of a photogrammetry model of the interior of this space, which has undulating floors, and you know, it's sort of very difficult to make your way around in there. You have to explore the modes of perception to do it, especially at night. Okay. So yeah, I know I never found a way to use this, but I just looked at this today and I just thought this is so beautiful. So I guess we could think of this as, you know, another model of space-time. Okay. I'm back. Thank you. That's great. Does anyone have questions or anything they want to bring up, or something must have been sparked from someone by something must have happened. Or you're just too overwhelmed. It's all been too much.
Too much?
Did it make sense, Randy?
It did make sense. It did to me, yeah.
Because when you start talking about art and relativity, you know, it's hard to make sense.
Yeah, but it did.
Hard to make sense of art, maybe not relativity.
That's true.
What does the Arakawa and Ginz house look like? I know their work, but I don't know what's on Long Island.
Well, it's a pretty dramatic place. I don't want to go back into screen sharing and dig up images, but you can look at it online, and it's this multicolored place, and it's kind of like bifurcated. So there's an old cottage that's sort of like a Frank Lloyd Wright type cottage, and then there's a corridor that leads into this vortex, which is what they built. And everything in there it's like a fun house, kind of.
Is it a private home?
Well, calling it a house is, you really couldn't live there. It's not a home. Someone tried to at one point, but It's more like a perceptual research facility, art research facility.
Can you visit it? I mean, can you get in?
There's a foundation that runs it, and so I think it's possible. The foundation has had some financial issues and some legal issues, so I don't really know right now what's going on there.
Good. I'd like to see it.
It's really worth seeing. It's an amazing experience to go there. And you should look online, just look it up. Bioscleve House, it's called.
Great.
Any other thoughts from anyone? Or I mean, I made some pretty dramatic claims there. That the whole chronology of photography into cinema is wrong.
Well, we've always known that, but not why, what the specifics are wrong. All history is wrong. We keep rewriting it. That's your job.
I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting research could be done on Constance Talbot. I think she needs some real attention. I'd like to see somebody do that. She needs
a good PhD thesis for a photo art historian. Huh?
Yes. I mean, just to go to Laycock Abbey and look up her camera lucida drawings would be interesting. But I think she really is part of who Talbot is. Talbot wouldn't be Talbot without her and without
his mother.
His mother, yeah.
In the book, are you going to be able to illustrate those stereopticons and some of these images in the way to which they deserve to be illustrated? Have we talked about that, or?
Well, we could talk about that. I mean, I don't. It's not a coffee table book.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of ways to see these things. Like anyone who has one of those VR systems that are designed for iPhones could look at them. Or you could learn how to look at them. I mean, Wheatstone, Claudet, they could just look and see them, and so can I. It's an interesting exercise to build that neuro pathway that allows you to do that.
Also, you could give the connection to the web to see those things in, more resolute and full color from than in the book.
Mm-hmm.
You could make a link. So everybody understands time and space now? Golly. Anybody buying some space travel there?
You have to be really rich.
Well, you can always buy a lotto ticket.
That was a heck of a lotto.
You bet. I bought one.
All right, well, I'm done talking. So Randy, you're the host, right?
I guess I am the host. Well, thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much.
Those nights were wonderful.
Good.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much. See everybody soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.